VNRC has been doing these webinars during this, this quarantine time that we're all going through as a way to update our members and other people interested in our work on the issues we work on, and so some of the key issues that are being debated in Vermont, in the legislature, in the regulatory agencies, sometimes in the courts. We've done several of these, and if you want to see what we've done in the past, you can go check that out. And if you want to see upcoming webinars, Stephanie could talk about that at the end. So this webinar is an update on Vermont's Clean Water Act, and it's hard to do these in a way because you could do a webinar on any of the topics we're going to talk about today. So our goal is to basically provide an overview of Vermont's Clean Water Act and the issues that are addressed in it, and then do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the key issues and some of the hot topic issues that we're seeing today. And I'm going to conduct this webinar with my colleague, VNRC's Ecological Restoration Coordinator, Karina Dailey. And Karina is pretty new to VNRC. She's come on board during this pandemic, and so it's been an interesting experience, I'm sure, for her to join an organization where our offices have been closed, but we've been working really closely over Zoom and email, and we put this together for you. So I'm going to get it started, and then I'll turn it over to Karina to address some specific issues. So why don't we just get into it? And I will take questions at the end. If you have questions, though, as we go through it, while they're fresh in your mind, there is a chat function on Zoom, and you click it, and you can write your question, and we can see it. And at the end, we'll go through them. So today we're going to talk. I'm going to give a brief history, very brief and very broad history of Vermont, the Vermont Clean Water Act of 2015. And then we're going to do a slightly deeper dive into the issues of stormwater, farm pollution, basin planning, and water funding, which are some of the key provisions of Act 64. And as I noted before, also some of the issues that are still pretty hotly contested today and we're still really grappling with. So Act 64, the Vermont Clean Water Act, what is it? Why do we have it? So I think it's helpful to take a real step back when you're talking about these issues, to remind ourselves how we got here and where we're going, and both to put things in context and to make sure we avoid the mistakes that we've made in the past as we go forward. So really, Act 64 is a response to decades of Vermont not meeting our obligations under the Federal Clean Water Act and our own water pollution control laws. The Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, and the focus during the first decades of the Clean Water Act implementation was on point source pollution, that is, pollution that's basically coming out of a pipe, wastewater discharges from municipal treatment plants, from industrial sources. I think everybody who signed up for this webinar, I'm sure, is aware of what was happening in the 70s, where we had the Cuyahoga River on fire. We had literally raw sewage in our rivers and streams in Vermont, and that was the focus of the Clean Water Act after it passed in 1972. But the Clean Water Act from the beginning addressed point source pollution and what we call non-point source pollution. And non-point source pollution is most commonly known as stormwater pollution and farm pollution. And in Vermont and around the country, we were doing basically a pretty terrible job dealing with stormwater and farm pollution, while we were really focused on point source pollution under the Clean Water Act. We also were not keeping up with our obligation to do basin or watershed planning in monitoring and evaluating waters and identifying the issues with water quality, whether water quality standards were met for certain waters, which is also required under the Clean Water Act, and with something called anti-degradation. And as we go through this webinar, we'll talk more about basin planning, watershed planning, and anti-degradation. So in response to the lack of focus, needed focus on non-point source pollution, in the 1990s, environmental advocacy groups from across the country started to sue EPA. They sued EPA for not monitoring and identifying waters that didn't meet water quality standards, which, as I said, is a requirement of the Clean Water Act. They sued EPA because EPA was not developing plans to clean up these waters if they were found not to meet water quality standards. As Vermonters, people may recall, during this time, the Conservation Law Foundation, or CLF, they brought challenges to stormwater permits that were causing and contributing to waters that didn't already meet water quality standards. And they got favorable rulings where the appellate bodies at the time were looking at what the Agency of Natural Resources was doing and saying, no, you can't add more stormwater to waters that are already polluted by stormwater and don't meet the standards. And at the same time, VNRC was making similar arguments in Act 250. It was a time where there was a lot of ski area expansion and a lot of ski area master plans, and a lot of the waters of ski areas were polluted by stormwater or sediment, and VNRC was coming in and with local groups like the Stratton Area Citizens Committee, and I see Darlene Palola is part of the webinar, and we could easily do a whole webinar just on those series of cases, but raising concerns that you shouldn't be allowed to add more stormwater pollution to those waters at ski areas under Act 250. So as a result of this legal pressure, in the late 90s and early 2000s, ANR finally proposed an EPA-approved TMDL, a cleanup plan for Lake Champlain, which was identified at that time for being polluted by too much phosphorus. TMDL means total maximum daily load. It basically means how much pollution can a water body handle and still meet standards. Again, we can do an entire webinar on TMDL, so I'm not going to get too deep into it. But the point is that after years of litigation, we finally got a cleanup plan for the Lake Champlain TMDL. At the time, and I was working with the Water Resources Board at the time, which administered Vermont's water quality standards. I think it was understood that the targets for pollution reduction in that early TMDL there was concern about the reliability of them, and there was concern about the actions to meet those targets. But overall, I think there was relief that we actually had a cleanup plan, and so we began to move forward. Around the same time, in response to the CLF lawsuits, we got rulings that basically said you can't add stormwater to those stormwater impaired waters without a cleanup plan under the Clean Water Act. So we started to get the Lake Champlain cleanup plan, and we got these stormwater cleanup plans. So in 2008, about 6 years after the Lake Champlain TMDL cleanup plan was adopted, CLF sued again, saying that the targets for the pollution reduction, the phosphorus reduction, and TMDL were not accurate. CLF argued they didn't factor in climate change. We've been seeing much more extreme rain events, much more, so additional loading of pollutants. And they questioned the original setting of the targets, which, as I noted, from the outset, I think there were questions about the basis for some of the targets. And after a lot of wrangling in 2010, EPA agreed with CLF and said that the targets in the Lake Champlain TMDL had to be revised. After 2010, there was a long period of time where ANR and EPA went back and forth about what the new target should be. And in 2015, we finally get new targets to clean up Lake Champlain from EPA. At the same time, Lake Champlain is not the only water body of concern in Vermont, far from it. As I mentioned, you have all the streams and rivers that have stormwater issues or sediment issues, the monitoring programs that had not been paid as much attention to under the Clean Water Act. As a result of a lot of the nationwide litigation, they started to become more robust. And so we were seeing the water quality problems that broadly existed in Vermont. There was, some examples. Lake Memphremagog has a phosphorus problem, and there was a TMDL cleanup plan set for Lake Memphremagog. Long Island Sound was designated as polluted by nitrogen, and there's a cleanup plan for that. Vermont's part of that because we contribute pollution with the upper end of the Long Island Sound watershed. And as I mentioned, all the stormwater polluted waters, they also needed cleanup plans. So Act 64, so this all is a very brief kind of preamble in terms of how we get Act 64. So in 2015, we get the new targets for Lake Champlain, and the legislature and the Shumlin administration basically work together to respond to the need to mostly deal with Lake Champlain, but also the other water quality problems, and the need to protect high quality waters, as you see in that second bullet. So you basically had all the water quality issues and the need for cleanup plans, but also part of the Clean Water Act from the beginning was if your waters are actually meeting water quality standards and they're actually healthy waters, you don't want to see those waters degraded. That's known as anti-degradation provision of the Clean Water Act, and it's in the Vermont Water Quality Standards. And so Act 64 was enacted to basically address all of these issues, and it's the primary component of what's known as the first phase of the Lake Champlain TMDL. So I just wanted to show a couple of slides just to, I'm sure most of you have seen this, but to kind of show what the problems are in these different areas, of these different water bodies. So for Lake Champlain, this is a graph that just shows overall where the sources of phosphorus are that need to be reduced. You can see agricultural lands is the bulk of it, 41%. You see that developed lands and stream instability combined make up over 30%, and that's really stormwater that's driving a lot of that. You can see wastewater treatment facilities are a smaller percentage because that's because, as I mentioned at the outset, the Clean Water Act did focus on those point sources of pollution. So I think that's why you see that overall loading number reduced. I think it's important always to remind ourselves what we're up against. This is a slide that's basically reminding us that if we're going to meet our targets for Lake Champlain, we're going to have to reduce 213 metric tons per year of phosphorus loading into Lake Champlain. So it's a daunting task, and there's a lot of work to do, and that's why we're relying on the Act 64 programs to do the bulk of that work. This is a slide related to the Lake Champlain TMDL that reminds us that this is about the lake as a whole, but the lake is broken up into different segments, and the TMDL actually breaks out the lake into segments and notes the pollutant load reductions needed for each segment. So we're looking at the lake as a whole, but we're taking actions really based on the segments of the lake. This is a slide that just shows the issues with Lake Memphremagog and phosphorus issue there and where the phosphorus is coming from there. Again, you can see agriculture is a huge part of the mix there, as is developed lands. And then this is a slide about the Long Island Sound nitrogen TMDL. I'm not going to get deep into it, but this presentation will be available to you. You could look at the slide. But there's a lot of analysis is the point that's been done about these pollution problems. So those are the problems and the opportunity to protect high quality water. So now we want to transition into some of the key parts of Act 64, which is hopefully going to restore some of these waters and reduce the pollutant loading problems that we have. And so I'm going to turn it over to Karina to talk about the stormwater components of Act 64.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening today. I know it's a beautiful day out there, but we appreciate your support. So in an effort to improve the quality of state waters from Act 64's all-in approach, the stormwater rules were rewritten to include a general permit for operational stormwater discharges on sites greater than 3 acres. Stormwater work was also included updates to the Vermont Stormwater Management Manual, which had not been updated since it was originally written in 2002. And the Municipal Roads General Permit was also created as part of Act 64 to directly address stormwater runoff on Vermont roads. Under the new stormwater operational permit, the next slide, John, if you want to switch slides, thanks. Landowners that have greater than 3 acres of impervious surface, such as rooftops, pavement, gravel, concrete, will need to apply for permit coverage. And for landowners with existing permits, it's important to know if their permit will cover the full extent of impervious surface on the property and when the permit was issued. The 3-acre permit only applies to existing impervious surfaces that are not permitted or that received a permit prior to 2002. In an effort to help identify which landowners may need a permit, there is a draft list that exists of suspected sites within the Lake Champlain Basin, and those sites would need to come into compliance. Once the permit compliance is identified, the next step is determining the feasibility of on-site stormwater treatment. So that's both financial feasibility and physical on-site design feasibility. In cases where on-site design may not be possible, there is an option of partnering with other landowners off-site, or worst case scenario, pay an impact fee if on-site treatment or partnership is not feasible. So the public comments associated with this permit have focused on the tight time frame for the engineering feasibility, as well as considering a 2-step process for compliance with a simple notice, like starting with a simple notice of intent, and then followed by preliminary feasibility, which would be submitted first, and then a final design and implementation. Compliance was planned for Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog basins in 2023, with the remainder of Vermont planned for 2033. But based on Julie Moore's statements last week, we aren't sure if this is still the case, as she mentioned that the schedule may be pushed back. So there are definitely overall questions that remain regarding permit implementation and compliance schedule, funding, engineering capacity, as well as the ability and flexibility to treat stormwater off-site.
Next slide.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah.
Next slide. Due to the advances in site design and best management practices, the 2017 Stormwater Manual provides the standards and requirements for compliance with the operational stormwater permit. These updates included a focus on green infrastructure design, which in the manual is referred to as stormwater treatment practices, or STPs. And examples of these practices might include incorporation of vegetated buffers, filter strips, green roofs, check dams, and reforestation. In addition to the integration of STPs for water quality treatment, the manual also includes design and sizing for groundwater recharge, downstream channel protection, flood protection, and reduced stormwater runoff. The manual works to ensure that runoff volumes delivered to local receiving waters after site development more closely mimic pre-development conditions. And the implementation of the manual is an important part of the strategy for TMDL requirements in impaired waters. Next slide. The Vermont Clean Water Act also required the agency to issue the Municipal Roads General Permit, or MRGP, to address stormwater runoff from municipal roads in order to meet the requirements of the Lake Champlain phosphorus TMDLs and to ensure overall water quality compliance. As you can see, I think a lot of you are probably familiar with the pictures on the right-hand side of our Vermont roads, dirt roads, that are increasingly experiencing washouts from storm events and just slow erosion of ditches over time and over seasons. So the MRGP requires municipalities to inventory their roads and prioritize areas for improvement and ultimately develop a roads stormwater management plan for 2021. The goal is that by targeting critical areas to reduce runoff and erosion within the state municipal road network, sediment and nutrient pollution would be reduced. The MRGP principles are based on stormwater best management practices, including stormwater disconnection, infiltration, stable conveyances, and properly sized and installed drainage culverts. And turning drainages away from existing water resources, including wetlands, is an important part of that. The permit applies to all municipal paved and unpaved roads and their supporting stormwater infrastructure. Each year, municipalities are required to implement a minimum number of road segments and upgrades to stay on track to full implementation and compliance by 2037. And then, John, I'll pass it to you for farm pollution.
All right. So farm pollution. So the main farm pollution provisions in Act 64 required an update in actually what were called the AAPs, or the Acceptable Agricultural Practices. They turned into the Required Agricultural Practices. The main issues of the focus of the update were to look at issues having to do with buffer zones between farms and watercourses, keeping animals out of the waters through fencing, soil health provisions, better management of manure, and nutrient management plans, and tile drains. So VNRC and our partners in the environmental community worked really very hard to try to make these required agricultural practices as strong as possible in all those areas. I think we've made really big improvements in all of those areas, but we still feel we haven't gone far enough in terms of buffers, keeping the animals out of waters. The nutrient management planning requirement is a good requirement. That basically is saying every farm needs to do an analysis of how much nutrients can be applied to the soil and keep in a way that'll keep the soil and the nutrients on the land and not going into the waterways. Those are good requirements, but there has been concern about implementation of that. So we've seen big improvements there, but I think we have a long way to go. And VNRC, is going to continue to argue for even further upgrades into the required agricultural practices. Act 64, for the first time, for a long time in Vermont, we've had regulatory programs dealing with medium farms and large farms in Vermont, and you can look that up. And for the first time, there was a requirement that small farms be brought into this program through the Agency of Agriculture, identifying small farms that need to be certified as complying with the RAPs. And the law was clarified to say that all farms need to meet these agricultural practices. Again, I think this was a step forward. There's been concern about implementation and enforcement. And that's the next bullet. Is there was a lot of talk and provisions in Act 64 about improving and increasing enforcement. There were provisions in the law that brought the Agency of Agriculture's implementation and enforcement of the water pollution control laws for farms more in sync with what ANR is doing, and it added some staff to the Agency of Agriculture. But we're still seeing, we get reports all the time of discharges from farms and concerns about water quality of farms, and we have serious questions and concerns about still the enforcement of these regulations. And we've always had a concern, and something that was not addressed in Act 64 is that Vermont is a state where its environmental agency, the Agency of Natural Resources, does not implement, as I've noted a couple of times, the water pollution control laws on farms, it's the Agency of Agriculture. So we've always felt that it'd be, it's a really, the proper way to do this is to have ANR implement and enforce these programs. And that's a debate that's still going on today. The Agency of Agriculture has traditionally done this. Farmers are generally more comfortable dealing with the staff of the Agency of Agriculture. Act 64 required better coordination between ANR and the Agency of Agriculture, but still it's the Agency of Agriculture that is implementing and enforcing these programs. If there is a discharge, and that's a term of art that's defined in the Clean Water Act, ANR must address that discharge, but we end up having debates about whether pollution from a farm meets the definition of discharge. Is it something that should be given over to ANR? And we still see these debates today, and from our perspective, it just slows things down, and it's really, there's a water quality problem, whether it is a discharge under the Clean Water Act or not, that we think ANR should address. The issue of tile drains, Act 64 required the tile drains be addressed. Karina, do you want to talk to this part of it?
Yeah. So yeah, for those of you who don't know what a tile drain is, tile drains are these underground pipes that are installed on cropland below the soil surface to collect water and convey water somewhere beyond the farm field. They're used by farmers to increase production on poorly drained soils and wetlands. The pipes collect water and nutrients from the soil and discharge it at the end of the pipe or the outfall, which can result in increased concentrations of surface water and nutrients downstream or downslope of the farm field. The RAP amendment in 2018 as part of the Clean Water Act included some restrictions related to tile drains, restrictions associated with NRCS manure stacking, not being allowed within 100 feet of tile drains, applications of less manure on tile drain fields, and restrictions of animal feedlots and barnyards on tile drain areas. So on those wetland, wet soils that are tile drained. But the rules did not address the overall water quality degradation caused by the tile drain installation, maintenance, and continued manure spreading on tile drain fields throughout Vermont. Vermont's tile drain rules are definitely contrary to many other states in the Midwest, which have restricted the application of manure period on tile drain fields. So we have lots to learn.
Yeah, and so they're like, I think one of the big issues here is that VNRC and the partners we work with feel that it's really settled that tile drains are major sources of phosphorus pollution, and there's no debate about that, and they really should be discontinued, and we shouldn't have new tile drains, and we should basically pull out the tile drains that we have. There are people who've made the argument that not all tile drains are bad, and we should analyze that more. And we're really moving too slowly, in our opinion, about even identifying the tile drains that exist on farms, figuring out which ones are causing the biggest problem and dealing with them. So this is an issue that is not going to go away. And as Karina said, there's more work to do for sure. One thing I wanted to mention, sort of stepping out of Act 64 specifically, is that, I alluded to this. VNRC believes that the RAP upgrades are not going to be enough to get us where we need to go. And even if we had perfect implementation of the RAPs, it still wouldn't be enough. And we don't have perfect implementation of them. And, there's been a big debate and discussion in the legislature and in Vermont over the last few years about the future of farming in Vermont. What does sustainable, economically sustainable, environmentally sustainable farming look like in Vermont? What is Vermont dairy farming that's sustainable look like in Vermont? Dairy farms have, even before this COVID crisis, were struggling financially. And, we've really been wrestling with how do we, move towards more sustainable practices. And and address the reality that farms have been struggling economically and not going to be able to, keep going as they had been even before COVID. There's been a lot of talk about ecological services that farms provide, the open land that they provide, and how to economically reward farmers for keeping land open and for allowing natural resources to exist that aren't impacted by development. And, from our perspective at VNRC, if we're going to have payments, we need to make sure that farms are moving towards sustainable practices, not using pesticides, not impacting wetlands, having, the buffers that go even beyond what the RAPs would require and what's necessary to, protect water quality. And I think we really feel like we need to think about how to incentivize farming that's going to be economically and environmentally sustainable. We all want, farms to exist in Vermont. We want the landscape to remain open, but we want it to be in a sustainable way, economically, in a way that doesn't have the environmental impacts that we've been seeing for years that we're grappling with through Act 64. So it's been a very difficult conversation, made even more difficult through COVID-19. I would note that there are bills moving through the legislature now that we're tracking that are going to provide relief for every sector of the economy, including farming. And we're talking about how to give our input to the legislature to say, if we're going to have these sort of relief bills, we need to basically pave the way for the future that we want and invest in and help these farms in a way that will be sustainable environmentally and economically. So you should follow those efforts. You can look on the Senate Agriculture Committee is talking about this right now. And if you're interested in this issue, I'd encourage you to go on the legislative website and keep track of the work that they're doing. So another really important issue in Act 64 is basin planning and anti-degradation. I'm going to throw it back to Karina for basin planning, and I'll talk a little bit about anti-degradation.
So yeah, as part of the Clean Water Act, it required the development of tactical basin plans for each of Vermont's 15 river basins. Tactical basin plans are written and prepared every 5 years to identify and prioritize the projects that are needed to protect and restore Vermont's waters and the funding sources to complete the work. So it's that process of identification and identifying those funding sources and those on the ground projects. They usually use annual monitoring and assessment data to guide their plans. Basin plans integrate priority issues identified on the state river corridor plans. They use stormwater master plans. They use the road erosion inventories. They use geomorphic studies. They use the water quality monitoring data that our local communities are doing with the conservation districts. And they use other landscape specific assessments to prioritize many of the on-ground water quality projects. So a basin plan may give special attention to protecting a high quality water or restoring habitat or removing barriers to water resource impairment. The map on the right identifies the 5 basin planners throughout the state that integrate the research combined with the stakeholder input to document geographically explicit actions to protect surface waters. And I'll pass it back to you, John, to go into the anti-degradation.
Yeah, thanks, Karina. So one word on basin planning. I think it's really amazing. Like, I think Act 64 has been really successful in beefing up this program, providing resources for this program, and more direction in terms of what happens in basin planning, that you identify waters that are of concern, waters that are special in communities, whether they're great, trout fishery or swimming hole or, whatever the community resource is, and it's calling them out for protection under the law. There are mechanisms under the law to give enhanced protection to these waters there's a classification process under Vermont law, Class A waters, Class B waters. There are outstanding resources waters. And the basin planning process has really been beefed up and directed to really have A&R work with communities to make those recommendations. Wetland identification is part of it. There are different classifications of wetlands. There's a higher classification of wetlands called Class 1 wetlands that now, as a result of Act 64, there's really direction to the agency to identify what are those wetlands that we need to give that higher level of protection to. And so this is all really part of what's known as anti-degradation. And we really could do a whole webinar on this. And if you're interested in that, let us know. And we'll do that for the real water quality geeks that are out there. But, basically, the Clean Water Act was brilliant in saying, not only do we need to identify waters that are polluted and clean them up, but we need to identify our high quality waters, our special fisheries, waters where water quality is high for certain parameters. And we want to make sure that we maintain that and don't slip. I think Act 64 was the third time, it might have been the fourth time, that the Vermont Legislature directed A&R to adopt an anti-degradation rule. And A&R has not adopted an anti-degradation rule since 2015, and they didn't do it before. And so this is a gap, and it needs to be addressed. And because we need to have a debate about what our specific policy is going to be to protect these high quality waters. A&R does have a procedure that's in place, that is not a rule, that VNRC does not believe is sufficient to implement this provision, but maybe a topic for another webinar with some other combined topics. But I just want to note that that's part of Act 64, and a really important part of the Clean Water Act that we still have not really implemented. And that brings us to the last topic, which is water funding. So part of Act 64, and a big part of our commitment to EPA under the Lake Champlain TMDL was that Vermont has to put up funding to show that it could meet these clean water obligations, that it could deal with farm pollution, it could deal with stormwater pollution, it's going to deal with the need to effectively deal with wastewater pollution. And so from 2015 to 2019, we had a long debate about, well, what could this long-term water funding be? Act 64 did create right away something known as the Clean Water Fund Board. It's now called the Clean Water Board, but it's really the Clean Water Fund Board in my mind, because they're really dealing with funding. They're not dealing with other issues. And the idea was that we knew we needed money. We have these regulatory programs. We have the point source permitting programs. We have our stormwater programs. We have our best, our RAPs for farms and some farm regulation programs. But we know that that's not all the pollution that's out there. We know that there's stormwater that is happening that's not being addressed. We know that there are water quality impacts that are not being regulated. And so the treasurer, Beth Pierce, was tasked with coming up with a report to recommend how much additional state money do we need. And just parenthetically, so we have a lot of federal money that flows into the state every year to help fund clean water. And so this really question was like, well, what additional state money do we need? The federal money, certainly a lot of it goes to wastewater treatment, stormwater infrastructure. There's something called the State Revolving Loan Fund that basically funds a lot of this municipal infrastructure. But what do we need if we're going to be successful in implementing Act 64? So the treasurer issued a report that said we needed approximately additional $25 million annually, recommended a bunch of different revenue sources. And I always want to, whenever I talk about this, credit Treasurer Pierce. She did an incredible job. She's a state treasurer. She, was not an expert in environmental issues. She's really got deep into this. And if you read her report, you can go on the treasurer's website and you can find her report, and you can see she lays out why why clean water is so important to Vermont's economy, let alone to Vermont's ecology. And she really, using her financial expertise, was able to explain what this gap in funding is and how the money should be spent. And her number has really held. And finally, in 2019, after 4 different goes at this, and about every revenue generation idea you can imagine, we came up with Act 76 of 2019, and the long-term funding that was set relied on the rooms and meals tax. 6% of the rooms and meals tax is directed to clean water funding, to the Clean Water Fund that is administered by the Clean Water Fund Board. A surcharge on the property transfer tax that did pass right away in 2015. It was a small amount of money relatively, but that money stayed in place. And then something called the sheets, which is basically when you buy soda or beer or something that's returnable and you don't actually return it, that lost return basically is called in a sheet. And that money, if you don't return your beer and soda and whatnot, and try to get your nickel, that money is going to go to clean water. So if you want to support clean water, you could drink soda or beer, or something healthier. I would go for beer rather than soda. That's just me. And then just don't return it, and that money goes to clean water. So we did settle on that, and we were feeling very good about ourselves that we found this long-term clean water source. And now we have COVID-19 that we're relying on the rooms and meals tax, and obviously people are not going to restaurants and they're not going to hotels. And so the fund is taking a really big hit right now. Federal money that we've relied on for the core clean water programs is taking a big hit right now. So we're very concerned about the financial impact of COVID in all of Vermont and on all of us and our families and our communities. And we're really concerned about the impact on clean water because it's going to be significant. We're following really closely the budget debates and A&R's testimony on budget impacts and their ideas to fill those gaps right now. I encourage you to do the same. If you care about these issues, I would let your representative or your senator know that, in addition to all our other needs, that you think clean water funding is vital. We can't backslide on, our obligations to clean up Lake Champlain, Lake Magog, the stormwater impaired waters, to protecting water quality. We have to find a way as we're grappling to how to fund government, as a result of this crisis. Clean water cannot be ignored. And so that's a big part of the work that VNRC is doing these days, and a really important issue. And check our website for updates and our email alerts, our e-news that comes out, because this is going to be debated over the next several months. So that's the money side of it. A big part of Act 66, which you may have heard of and maybe you've been working on, is how do you distribute the funds? So we have this clean water fund, and if the fund has the money in it that we want, how are we going to get the money out there for these projects that are in between sort of the regulatory obligations that we have? Things like ecological restoration projects and dealing with farm pollution that is, somehow outside of the regulations, or stormwater. And so the bill that passed last year basically creates clean water service providers around the state. They're all going to have a watershed management, a watershed area for each provider. They're going to have a load allocation for the amount of phosphorus that must be reduced. And they're going to get a block grant from the state from the Clean Water Fund to basically, over a 5-year period, meet its pollution reduction obligations. We're at the very beginning of this process when COVID-19 hit. Agencies in the process of taking requests for entities that want to be clean water service providers. So that's very important. And then once they're chosen, the agency is going to give pollutant reduction allocations to each provider for each watershed area. And then it's going to create load reduction values for certain practices. So we could, if you're a clean water service provider and you work on a stormwater issue and you put in a stormwater practice, or you put in a buffer in an area, there'll be a modeled calculation of how much pollution reduction is that worth to see if you've met your target. So these are huge decisions that have not been made yet. They're in the process of being made. So we're following it really closely. If you're interested in this, look up Act 76 on ANR's website. Get involved with your, you're looking about basin planning in your area. If you have a local watershed group or a conservation commission, or you're aware of and do some work with conservation districts, all those entities are really involved with this process, and as is VNRC and our partners, and want to make sure we set this up right. So assuming that we actually have money, which we're going to fight for, we have a reasonable system to allocate that money and accurate load allocations and practices that will reflect how much pollution is going to be reduced. So I think that is all that we have, and we can take questions. And so Stephanie, I don't know if I can't see the questions, if there are any.
Yes, there are indeed some questions. So thank you, John. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So we had a comment from Cree, but I'll start with Paula's question. She says, what will happen with the news of finding PFOAs and manure sludge spread on farms, including the only farm in Essex Junction? That one is on both sides of the Winooski, which means PFOAs will eventually end up in the lake.
So, yeah, so that's something that's a whole other ball of wax entirely. So there has been a lot of work done on concern about toxic chemicals, generally toxic chemicals in the groundwater, in the surface water, in our soils. And there's been specifically concerns about the land application of waste leading to PFOA or PFAS chemicals, which are perfluorinated chemicals. The part of the class of chemicals that got released in Bennington that contaminated the water there. And so right now, ANR is looking at a host of issues in terms of regulating these chemicals. Chemical regulation in Vermont and across the country is pretty weak. And until the Bennington discharge happened, PFAS chemicals were not even listed as a waste. They were not listed as a contaminant in drinking water or surface water. They are now listed as a contaminant. There's a groundwater standard for certain PFAS chemicals. There is not a surface water standard yet for PFAS. And so that is something that ANR is required to adopt over the next few years. And so right now, there really isn't, it's not illegal. They're not in violation of the law yet as these chemicals get into surface waters. And there's been a debate about whether we should stop land applying waste. And that is still occurring out there. And VNRC is very concerned about it. But I think you should let ANR know you're concerned about this. You should let your legislator know. And I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of setting those surface water standards and prohibiting these land application practices that are, appear to be contaminating our soil and our water. So this is all in flux right now. So I don't have a better answer than that.
Okay, let's go to Cree's question next.
Karina, you have something you want to add, Karina?
Well, I said as part of that, we're also working to limit the PFOAs coming into the state, both through on carpets and firefighting foam and food packaging. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, this is like a multifaceted thing. The PFAS chemicals are in most of our products. They're in all the products that Karina just mentioned. They're in our landfills, and that's how they end up getting waste from landfills. It gets sent to treatment plants, and that waste gets discharged directly to water. It ends up in it's in our waste, so it ends up in, if it's land applied in our soils, and it leaches out per the question. So we want to try to at the front end make sure that we're not using PFAS in products that's getting into the waste stream, and then getting good regulations to prohibit it from being discharged to our waters.
Okay, so Cree asks, She says, it seems that recent Supreme Court ruling the Clean Water Act includes pollution flowing through groundwater will profoundly impact enforcement issues. What about subsurface tile drains?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Kree's referencing a really hopeful, a really great Supreme Court decision that came down a few weeks ago that basically there was a discharge in Hawaii. There was a treatment plant that was basically taking waste, putting into a deep well, and then the well was slowly discharging into surface water, and the discharger was basically saying it wasn't covered by the Clean Water Act because it was going through groundwater. It wasn't directly going from the plant into the receiving water. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, that is covered by the Clean Water Act because, it's still direct, you're sending it from your plant into the groundwater and it's going directly into the receiving water. Just because it makes a stop in this well does not mean it's not covered by the Clean Water Act. And so that is hopeful in terms of making this connection between groundwater and surface water and pollution that we've been arguing about for years. I think, hydrologists will, point out that it's all part of the same system. And, we shouldn't draw these sharp lines between groundwater discharge and surface water discharge. In terms of tile drains, I would argue that is already a direct discharge, that this decision is not even really needed to address that issue, because if you have pollution going into a tile drain and that tile drain is going directly into receiving water, that already is a discharge that should be is regulated under the Clean Water Act and should be subject to A&R regulation and not Agency of Agriculture regulation. But as I'm saying that, I could see Kree's, what she might be thinking is that there may be situations where there are tile drains, groundwater, and then it goes into the surface water. So I think this case could be helpful in that regard. But I think that, as we talked about earlier, we're not, even the direct discharges from tile drains, we're just not dealing with right now. But as I'm saying this, Kree, I think that this case could help with that. If you find the right case, I think you'd have a good argument there.
Great. Mark has asked, COVID aside, would the funds raised by Act 76 have met the $25 million requirement?
So I think the estimate was that last year it was going to raise about 20 million. So like the treasurer said, we needed 25 million. And then the state, and then you had, that was the rooms and meals tax. And there was a little bit more from the sheets and the property transfer tax. So it was pretty close. And then I'll give the state credit. A&R did use some general fund money and then capital fund money to get even above the $25 million for the Clean Water Fund. So I think it's very close. I think, like I said, last year it was like 20 million rooms and meals, probably 22, 23 million when you added in the sheets and the property transfer tax. And then A&R had been last year and in previous years, they did have a good commitment of some general fund money and capital fund money put into the fund. Obviously, with all the budget problems now, that all comes under question in terms of how much general fund money would be used if there are shortfalls in the rooms and meals tax.
Kathy had a clarification. She says, just making clear that the clean water service providers are being organized in the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog watersheds first. Connecticut River and Hudson will come later. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy.
It looks like those are all the questions we have. We do have a few more minutes if anyone's got something last minute to add. Otherwise, I'll ask John and Karina to close us out.
Well, thanks everybody for taking time out of this beautiful afternoon to listen to us rattle on about clean water. And, like I said, any of these topics could be a webinar. If you're interested in more information about any of these topics or other webinars or, you'd like to see VNRC do, let us know. Karina, what do you want
Yeah.
to add a word or?
I want you guys for everyone to get outside and enjoy the environment and the water, especially during this time. It's more important than ever. So enjoy the day.
Well said, Karina.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.